Good morning. Thank you for joining our breakout room on designing group projects for Engaged Scholarship. You'll see we're sharing a slide. It's got basically the agenda for our session. And I think that my co-host, Lee, has put into the chat a link to a Padlet. So I don't know if this is bringing bad flashbacks to people to the COVID times when we were all on Zoom and using these kinds of collaborative softwares. But what we are hoping you will do to kick off our session is to share something with us in the first column of that Padlet. So what is something you're hoping to learn from this session? We want to know a little bit more about your interests that got you through the door. There's kind of maybe a lot of angles to this issue. And we're also, so we're going to use that information for kind of two things. One is to hopefully shape the kinds of questions that we ask of our wonderful panelists in this time that we have with them. And also we're thinking towards the future and perhaps putting together a resource like a frequently asked questions document to sort of share post our session, because we certainly can't cover everything about designing group projects for Engaged Scholarship with just one, I don't know, slightly longer than an hour session. As a way of introduction, hi, I'm Eleanor Finnegan. I'm Assistant Director of Faculty Programming at the Bach Center, where I'm really fortunate to work with faculty and graduate students in creating transformative learning experiences in Harvard College. I'm being joined by Lee LaFleur, and I will let Lee briefly introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eleanor. My name is Lee LaFleur, and I am the Associate Librarian for Research, Teaching, and Learning for FAS. And like Eleanor, I'm really excited to be here and to have an opportunity to be a part of this conversation with each of you. So as you have hopefully seen, we have a roster of excellent speakers who are going to share their experience at the intersections of group projects and Engaged Scholarship with all of us today. First up, we'll have Caitlin Schmid from the Phillips Brooks House, Assistant Director of Engaged Scholarship. And she's going to talk a little bit about Engaged Scholarship, some of the background, give some background on Engaged Scholarship, and also how Mendich supports courses that are planning and conducting Engaged Scholarship. Then we'll have Sachit Balsari, Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine, talking about their course, the Gen Ed course, Gen Ed 1011, Contemporary Developing Countries, Entrepreneurial Solutions, and Intractable Problems. And then next up, we'll have a collection of speakers, Marshall Gans, who is the Rita E. Hauser Senior Lecturer in Leadership, Organizing, and Civil Society. We'll have Emily Lynn, Program Director of the Center for Public Leadership, and Maggie Hughes, a PhD candidate in Media Arts and Sciences in the Center for Constructive Communication at MIT's Media Lab. And they'll be talking a little bit about the MLD 377, Organizing People, Power, and Change course, and also a related study, some research that they've been doing on the formation of teams that crosses over into civil sector work. And with that, I think we'll get started with you, Caitlin.
I just want to hop in for one more quick second to say we'd love to be fielding your questions in addition to the ones we've asked for already. So feel free, we'll be monitoring the chat to put them there, or you can put them into our Padlet. You may see we've already started to try to think about some categories we might use to organize FAQ questions. We're also hoping that after each speaker, we'll be able to field one question and then hold on to the rest of them so that we can have a little bit more of sort of a panel experience at the end. So take it away, Caitlin. Thank you.
Thanks to Lee and Eleanor for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here today. The Mendich program in Engaged Scholarship creates curricular and co-curricular opportunities for civically engaged experiential learning with Harvard College. So that means courses, but it also means summer research and internship opportunities, cross-school working groups, events, spaces for students to think about what we call the so what, for what, and now what of their academic experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific support structures that we offer later, but I wanted to start by giving a brief framework of how Minditch thinks about engaged scholarship, teaching, learning, research. We usually begin with this umbrella definition. Engaged scholarship is an orientation to academic work that connects the rich resources of the university to our most pressing social, civic, and ethical problems. And the emphasis here is really on orientation. There's no one way to go about engaged scholarship. It's necessarily going to look different across disciplines, across issues, according to the needs of particular community partners. The Minditch program currently supports about 15 to 20 classes a semester, and this is a list of our classes that we're working with this semester, just to give you a sense of the range. The engaged component of these courses ranges from one discrete assignment all the way through to a fully immersive, community-directed, semester-long project. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what this might be like on the assignment end of the spectrum, we worked with a course a couple of years ago about the history of sports at Harvard that asked students to conduct oral history projects with women athletes, especially Radcliffe alumni. And then the transcripts of those oral histories were deposited in Schlesinger Library. So students were interacting with community members, and they had a relatively minimal time requirement for both them and for their community partner. And the final product was public facing rather than something that was for a particular partner. Then you have something like a more immersive advanced Spanish language course where students are placed with community organizers within the Boston area, and they volunteer for 4 hours every week during the semester. So they really bring together language proficiency, course content that's focused on Latina experience in the US, and then direct service with Latina serving organizations. So those two sides of the course feed into each other at every moment. Those are both forms of engaged scholarship in the context of teaching. And I think more generally, they offer two different takes on scope of work, on time expectations, on depth of the relationship with the community partner, and how to integrate these partnerships into the larger project. And all of those are useful starting points for developing engaged teaching, but also engaged research. So having said that there isn't a standard method or model for engaged scholarship, there are, I think, a few key pieces of that orientation that we look for when we think about what a Minditch course is. This kind of academic work is relational. It's about building relationships between the classroom and the community and making connections with people who might have different experiences and expertise and viewpoints. It's experiential. This is high quality scholarship that bridges theory and practice. So what could it mean to take academic knowledge and do something with it on behalf of a community partner? It's socially responsible. And I think the big through line question is, what is ethical engagement in the context of academia? And it's reflective. This is the sort of so what, for what, now what piece that I mentioned earlier. Engaged scholarship encourages reflection on everything from the nature of community to power and privilege to our own positionality in this work. So these ideas are key to engaged scholarship generally, but they're also the reason that engaged scholarship and group work in the classroom are such a great fit. And I know this has been a lot of theory so far, and obviously Minditch wants to deliver on practice as well. So I have a couple of course examples for you that emphasize teams and sort of talk about why they work. So this first course is a social studies course about urban health and community change in partnership with the City of Somerville Department of Health and the Somerville Community Health Agenda. So students worked in small teams. They conducted group and individual interviews with community stakeholders on questions that were shaped by their interactions with the Somerville Community Health Agenda, on everything from housing and homelessness to food security. And then each group synthesized their data and developed findings and recommendations that they presented to the Somerville mayor. A second class is a music class about music and social engagement. 4 small groups of students each partnered with one of those musicians. And over the course of many meetings, they learned about their music, about their culture, about the challenges of being a musician in this context. And through these conversations, the students co-developed a plan to offer professional support that included developing web resources, publishing interviews, and even producing a final concert in the class. So in both cases, these courses are about building relationships, right? It's built into the premise of the class, and related skills are scaffolded into the course structure. And while students are building these relationships with partner organizations, they're also building relationships within their own small groups and classes. And in this music class, for example, one of the small groups ended up staying in touch, and they reunited at a lunch at their musician partner's house in the following school year. The experiential and the social responsibility pieces go hand in hand. The social studies classes, right, they talk to these residents on behalf of Somerville Community Health Agenda in response to health inequities. The music students theorize music and social engagement while getting to know musicians as individuals who themselves are using music as a form of social engagement. I think it's not news that there's often pushback about group work from students, right? It's an extra level of logistical challenge. They're worried about who's going to contribute what. But in my experience, it's very clear to students why group work in engaged scholarship courses is necessary, right? Teams of students can take on bigger projects. They can interview more community stakeholders. They can plan more concerts. Whatever the project is, they can do more of it. And the Q evaluations for these courses and for every Minditch course really bear this out. So engaged scholarship raised the stakes. Seeing the real world applications of what we were learning pushed me to want to more deeply understand everything we were learning. It made it much easier to stay motivated because we knew that any assignment we submitted wouldn't just be saved on a TF's computer after being graded, it would actually be considered and potentially implemented. And then finally, there's this reflection piece, right? So going through an experience with a group allows students to have partners in reflection, to build in a kind of ethical gut check as they're talking through what they're doing and why they're doing it together. And then also to think about how what they might learn could inform future careers and pathways. So we get a lot of evaluations that mention, that they're thinking about what they're going to do after they graduate. Most of the non-engaged scholarship courses I've taken have helped me think about knowledge, but not about action. And I hope the engaged scholarship course options grow, the student says. So zooming out, we've sort of been talking about the benefits for students who participate in group work in an engaged scholarship context. And there are real benefits for the community partners as well. So when we do debriefs at the end of the semester, we hear that these kinds of teamwork-oriented engaged scholarship courses help provide and also especially expand services to community members. And we've heard over and over that the learning goes both ways. The students value the expertise of their partners on the ground, and the partners appreciate that the students are bringing new skills and especially new mindsets to the table that are rooted in sort of the theory side of the class. I also think there's lots of value for faculty, both in the sense that these courses and these projects are often related to their research and they offer all kinds of opportunities for building relationships. But also the students overwhelmingly choose to be in these courses despite extra time commitments, if you're sending them off campus, whatever it is that you're doing. And I've always really found that feeling that engaging with communities is worthwhile also translates to a feeling that it's worthwhile to build in-class communities. So if you're interested in more specifics about any of these classes, please let me know. I'm happy to give you more details or put you in touch with faculty. But to end, I just want to give sort of the briefest overview of what the Minditch program might be able to do for you. Our main focus is on undergraduate pedagogy, but we have built up a collection of resources and links that I think could be useful to anybody starting to think about engaged teaching, learning, or research more broadly. And Eleanor, if you wouldn't mind putting that handout in the chat, I'd be grateful. We have tons of online resources, right? Everything from sort of foundational literature to sample syllabi to assessment rubrics. And I've pulled together this Getting Started with Engaged Scholarship handout that should give you some places to start. I particularly want to point out the third entry, the Engaged Scholarship Digital Library, which is a living bibliography of articles and handouts that relate to both teaching and research. And then the first link in the gray box will also take you to our landing page for all Minditch resources, and there's a lot there too. If you decide to teach a course or there's an event within your department that seems like it would be a really good fit, we can help with design and development. We can fund teaching staff and help bring collaborators from outside of Harvard to campus. We can connect faculty, staff, and students from across schools who are interested in similar topics and issues. So for example, the Abolition Collaboratory is an inclusive working group that is housed within Minditch. And we also offer summer grants for students who are interested in engaged research and then can bring those findings and ideas back to their departments. So I think the bottom line is to get involved with Minditch, please send us an email. We're really happy to talk with you about a project in any stage of the development. And if you need one more piece of evidence as to why you should consider engaged scholarship, there you have it. Thanks very much and hope to hear from you.
Yeah, we wanted to ask if there is a question that anyone has at the front of their mind to ask Caitlin before we move on to Sachet's presentation. And if not, I've got a good one out of the comments in the Padlet. Yeah, Rodas, I hope I've gotten close with your name. I'm sorry if I have not.
You have. Good morning, everybody. I'm not a student, so first of all, thank you for putting together this workshop. I was really looking forward to it. I graduated from the Kennedy School in 2021, so I and I am a fellow currently with the Shorenstein Center. So as a fellow, do I qualify for some of these programs? Because they really look interesting, but I know the emphasis is on students.
The Mintage program really is focused with undergraduates, but we're always interested in sort of talking with you about projects. And I think like this Abolition Collaboratory that I mentioned at the end is a working group for faculty, staff, students, postdocs, fellows, I mean, whoever wants to be a part of it. So I think we're always open to talking about ways to bring more people in, and like would be glad to talk with you.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. I'll reach out.
Sounds good.
Great. Wendy.
Thanks, Caitlin. Do you have a sense of the criteria for the community partners? Do you have any kind of qualifying criteria or any advice that you would give us about their capacity to be able to support as well as benefit in the ways that you described? So
yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on the project, and every partner is going to have a different capacity, right? So one of the things that we often talk about is coming up with a memorandum of understanding so that everybody knows very clearly sort of what's going to happen and when. And we have some examples of those on our websites as well. And we would definitely be happy to talk with you about more specific, if that's useful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all. We're going to move on to our next speaker, but again, remember, this is not the last opportunity to ask questions. So be holding on to those till the end of the presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. This is so incredible to hear, and I'm really thrilled to hear about the Mintage program. I'm an emergency physician. A lot of my work is mostly overseas in global health, and increasingly the refrain over the last couple of decades has been, you know, why don't US universities look at their own backyard and engage with their own communities? And I'm really pleased that we're having these conversations. I'll introduce the course and some course mechanics before I sort of dive into talking about our group work and engagement. This course has now been around for just over 10 to 12 years. I've been co-teaching it for the last 8 years or so. It is taught by 5 faculty members from across the university. It's called Entrepreneurial Solutions to Intractable Social and Economic Problems. This is an old flyer. This is one of the original iterations. It was SW47. It is now Gen Ed 10.11, and it's registered across several graduate schools at Harvard. It's taught by Tarun Khanna, professor at the business school, who started and conceptualized the course. And we collaborate with Doris Sommer, a professor of Romance languages from FAS, Shustov Gayos, computer scientist from the engineering school, and Raul Marotra, an architect from the design school. The classroom typically has about half undergrads and half grads. The graduates are from across the university, not just the schools that you see up here. So you'll have, you know, Divinity School graduates is sitting next to business school and Kennedy School grads, and typically about 60 to 70 undergrads. You know, the class size is anywhere between 80 to 120 over the last decade or so. We have assignments sort of woven in throughout the course, and the goal of the course is the following. We bring together these various lenses, you know, thinking like a scientist, thinking like a planner, thinking like an artist, to understanding both the necessity to think about transdisciplinary approaches to problem solving, given the intractable problems we face in the world today, all the way from sort of food insecurity to climate change and housing crises and whatnot. As though the course name says contemporary developing countries, increasingly over the last several years, students have wanted to engage in domestic topics, and that's always been welcome. The way the course is structured, Tarun and I set up the foundational lectures for the course. It's very case-based. A lot of the cases are written by faculty at the Harvard Business School, but then you have me teaching some of the courses from the public health school, and it's always fun to watch a reaction on other faculty faces, because the same case, depending on who's teaching it, has very different discussion points highlighted in the course. Sometimes the opposite than intended. Once that foundation is settled, we then have the 3 different lenses introduced by the faculty from their own disciplines. And the sequencing has often been a challenge, and it is entirely dependent on faculty availability. But typically, we start with design thinking that Krzysztof Gajos introduces, followed by thinking like an artist, which is often quite a whiplash for the class, because they're really in the weeds and thinking like a scientist, and then they are suddenly discussing aesthetics and Kant, and it takes them a little while to appreciate why these 2 very different dimensions that are actually very complementary but don't seem to be initially are introduced into the class, followed by a planner. The course then ends with sort of a final module where we take examples from really challenging cases around the world and sort of discuss how they were successfully imagined and executed. Through this entire semester, the students have to work in groups. And this is how we help structure the group. They learn about cases from around the world, certainly from the global south, some more domestic. We span, education and questions of identity and security, health, food safety, and whatnot. As they are learning about these cases, this is what their journey looks like. By week 2 or 3, they start understanding the scale at which we are hoping that they would start thinking, and they have to identify problems that they really want to work on. And that is their first public declaration through their pitch poster of what they want to work on. And I'll walk through this timeline sequentially. So thanks to our online teaching environment, we're actually very effective now in being able to help students see what the others are interested in. So pre-pandemic, this was done through sort of one-page documents, but we pivoted to flyers where they pitch their idea. And then these are posted on a Miro board, because by like week 3 or 4, the students have to form their own groups across undergraduate and graduate teams, coalescing around the problem that they want to solve. So we post the flyers, both regionally and cluster them regionally and thematically, so they begin to get a sense of what their other classmates are interested in. And then there is a live mixer. So the photograph you see in the bottom is the free pizza after class, where they get to go from table to table and learn about each other's projects. This has worked, both without the Miro board and with, and I find it quite mind-boggling that it does. I think it would really freak me out. But they managed to find, like-minded students across schools, across seniorities, to form their teams. And typically we find that no more than 1 or 2 teams struggle with the team constitution. And I'll speak a little bit about how we manage that. Once they start self-identifying what their group looks like, we then request them to sign a team contract where they have to, in writing, address how they will deal with surprises, how will they deal with conflict, because it is a group activity, and now at least some portion of their grades are, tethered to each other's performance. How do they sort of build an accountability, et cetera, right? And it sort of forces them to think about how to deal with a process that seems fair, especially if there's an age gap between team members. Once the team contract is done, then they start the project. So the goal is to work on a very large, complex problem. And throughout the course, the assignments all lead incrementally towards a final product, which can be a material product, a program. It can take any form, but what they are coming up with is their group solution to an intractable problem. And throughout that process, they have to engage with the community or the target audience that they are trying to solve the problem for. So necessarily, the course discourages them from hypothesizing on what these difficulties may look like sitting at Widener. They're very much encouraged to go outside. Pre-pandemic, there was a brief need-finding exercise that was not related to that project, where they were given one of two options: to either engage with Harvard tourists and help understand how the Harvard tour could be made more pleasurable for them. And so they're forced to go and talk to a bunch of strangers on campus, or they could meet with individuals or groups that are extremely different from them, whom they know possess a social or political belief which the students do not identify with, and they have to try and understand the other person's perspective. This was before the world fell apart the way it has in the last several years. So we used to do this pre-pandemic. Since the pandemic and even now, the need finding directly contributes to need finding on the problem that they want to solve. And so they are encouraged to pick up the phone or go meet the communities that they want to work in. A lot of them are doing international projects. And so it's over email and Zoom conferences, et cetera. But they have to, if they want to solve water access in a village in Ethiopia, we really encourage them to figure out to speak to a few people from the village in Ethiopia. And we give them training on how not to misrepresent themselves and to be very clear and transparent about how this is a class exercise. And it may or may not morph into real world change. And I'll come to that in a second. The next few steps, and I won't belabor those so that I can sort of reach to the end of the discussion, basically walks them. There's a lot of hand-holding to encourage diversity of thinking and ideas and convergence. And so based on the needs finding, each of them has to come up with key insights, 5 or 6 insights that they learn from the community, and then articulate why those insights may spur ideas of the solution that they're thinking about. Based on this affinity diagram, each student has to come up with 10 potential solutions. And so that's sort of the divergence, and then negotiate down to 2 solutions. And that's the convergence that they as a group decide to work on. And they will then present 2 substantive products as part of the deliverable there. Those products have to reflect, fairly rigorous research, not just sort of phone chats, literature review, reflections from class, apply lessons that they've learned in class, etc. So that's sort of a very substantial deliverable then, where they have to come up with 2 completely different ideas, but both very well researched. We then encourage them to go back to the communities and peddle these ideas there and test them out and see what the community thinks. And it's often again online, and we also provide opportunities for peer feedback where they can pitch their ideas to their classmates. Often after class, we hold 2 sessions where they are provided peer feedback, both verbally as well as written. The teaching staff, including the faculty, meet with each group at least once. Typically, the TFs will meet a couple of times and the faculty will meet at least once with every single group. Not all 5 faculty, but Tarun and I and others if the students want to meet a particular expert. And so we keep a close eye on group dynamics, sort of, making sure that everyone feels that they are both engaging with the community outside and throughout the group as well. And these are often done in informal settings where it's a little bit more relaxed and unhurried. We try and spend half an hour to an hour with them talking about their projects. This sort of journey finally leads them to the final assignment, that they submit at the end. Other opportunities for group engagements, which is a different group composition, is of course sections for the undergrads, but there are discussion boards where we rotate the composition of the discussion board. Instead of having 100, 120 students chat on one discussion board, we have 4 or 5 discussion boards, and every few weeks we mix up who is engaged on the discussion board so that they get a lot of different perspectives. Because of the composition of the student body, in this class, we found that especially the graduates often come from around the world from very different backgrounds, and the undergrads find it to be quite a treat because you're often learning about a case and someone's been part of the foundation or the organization or the intervention that you're talking about, and you get sort of nice real world experience in class itself. Finding results in a whole range of projects. Just a few examples here where they want to develop a business development plan in refugee camps. They want to advance menstrual hygiene, empower women, fix food security. The one with the tomatoes was very prescient. It was really about cold storage and how that is so critical to both the economy and food security in several African countries. There was a wonderful New Yorker article actually last week on this. The faculty end up learning a lot. A concluding observation I'd like to make is that this has been a lot of fun for the faculty as well. The students, of course, sort of never leave. Even through the second semester, they keep coming back. They want to work on their projects. Many of them apply to the iLab and the President's Challenge and the Mithal Institute grants to try and take some of their ideas to the real world. And, every couple of years, someone is out there able to launch a company or an intervention. But the faculty over the last 10 years have also started working together. We come from very different disciplines, and being exposed to each other's ideas and thoughts for several years. And I think it takes that much time to really do rich interdisciplinary work. In various permutations, all 5 of us now also work together, and we didn't really know each other when we started. So that's also been an added advantage and a treat. Let me pause there. I may have gone over time, but thank you for listening and take questions.
Yeah, you did great. Thank you very much, Sajid. I do think we have time to see if there are questions. And again, we also have the Padlet that's in the background that I know some folks are adding questions and comments to. I just put it in the chat again a little while ago.
If no one wants to volunteer a question right now, one thing that you mentioned, Sajid, and that I think also connects to at least one of the questions that we have here on the Padlet is, what do you do about those students who can't really find a group? Or what do you do perhaps if there's a mismatch in enthusiasm among students in a group?
Yeah. No, that's true. The students that don't find a group, we handhold a fair amount and, go over all the projects with them, see where they fit in. We approach a few groups before sending the student to them, ask them if they would be open to considering someone else, and then match, and every student eventually lands up with a group. The rare occasion where you have someone that is not pulling their weight, we meet with them in sort of a graded fashion, where first the section TF or the discussion board TF, if this is a graduate student, will chat with them. Seldom has it ever been bumped up to the faculty level. I think you just need to call out people and remind them of the contract and sort of the educational value in being held accountable. Over the last several years, I probably remember one case where it ended up being very problematic, where a student would just not change behavior, where we needed to factor that into grade assignments, of course, and be very transparent about that, because you do need to let both the student and the group know. But it's unfair to the rest of the group, where they feel like the grades are being dragged down because of someone's performance, especially if they don't finish their deliverables on time. Ramona.
I'm hoping you can share some examples of how did it turn out with the thinking like a scientist, thinking like a planner, like an artist. Can you share just in the outcomes, in their final projects, were there some who took more of an artist lens, or some who took more of a science lens, or were people largely integrating across all three lenses? I'm really curious how that worked out.
Yeah, so all of the above. But we find that they mostly integrate across three lenses. What we try to remind them is not every solution necessarily lends itself to every lens, right? To sort of not force it. So, sometimes you find that a solution is sort of very programmatic or scientific, and then there is, some street theater added onto it, where clearly they're struggling to apply the artist lens. Interestingly, note on the artist lens is it is the module that they feel most stunned by when they go into it, and it is the one that they constantly quote and gravitate towards again and again as they think about their solutions. And this has been consistent over the last several years. They start off all sort of very mechanical, and they're all drawn towards understanding sort of the soft thresholds and the blurry edges around some of these problems. And so that's been reassuring.
That's
Thank
great.
you. Oh,
May I ask a follow-up, or Lee, did you want a turn? That's fine too.
we were going to move on, I think, to the next speaker. Do you have a quick
Just a
follow-up?
really quick follow-up, in just that I was wondering, at what point I assume before they're speaking with the people, the groups of people with which they're partnering, they probably have to do some research on them. And I was just curious if that is something that you ostensibly purposefully build into the class, or just sort of hope they'll figure it out.
No, the needs finding is actually quite rigorous, because there are gradations of experience in these groups as well, right? And especially if you have a group that's undergrad heavy, they may be very idealistic, but you also do not want them to be calling people and providing solutions or presenting them with questions that are so naive that you're being disrespectful to the other person's time, right? There's that balance between allowing them free inquiry and exploration, but also knowing that often these folks are very busy at the other end, and essentially they're entertaining students from a privileged school that's curious about their life. So we do make them think really hard in the need finding process, where they have to be we have to see where they are before they start reaching out to folks.
Thank you, Ramona, and thank you, Sachit. We will move on to our next group of speakers. First up, I believe Marshall Gantz, Rita E. Hauser, Senior Lecturer in Leadership, Organizing, and Civil Society, will tell us a little bit about the MLD 377 course. Take it away, Marshall.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Good morning. I guess it's still morning. I want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to contribute to learning, learning about teaching, and particularly the teaching of practice, which is what we have focused on doing. So the presentation, I'll be setting a context, and then you'll hear from Emily Lynn and Maggie Hughes, who are leading the research component on this work. And these are our goals. The work that we're doing is around creating collective capacity in the context of leadership development. So it starts with that approach, then a pedagogy of practice, then self-governing leadership teams, and then how to launch self-governing leadership teams, and then the learning we've been doing from that, if that is helpful. Now, our approach to leadership is probably not the most common one. It's rooted in these three questions posed by the first century scholar Rabbi Hillel. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Not selfish, but rooted in the significance of self-awareness. The second, if I'm for myself alone, what am I? Because to be a who and not a what is to recognize that we exist in relationship with others. And finally, if not now, when? Not advice to jump into moving traffic, but a caution against what Jane Addams called the snare of preparation. Just another year of strategic planning, we'll have the perfect plan, and then the world will conform, except it never works that way. In other words, it's a sustained and ongoing kind of thing. Approaching leadership in this way also focuses on the fact that the dominant condition under which leadership is needed is not certainty, but uncertainty. In other words, the adaptive, when everything's working fine and the routines are working, what do you need leadership for? It's working. The adaptive, initiative-taking, creative dimension of leadership is needed when there are challenges, problems, and contradictions and opportunities. And so it's a challenge both to what we think of as the hands, the skills. Do I have the skills I will need? To the head, a strategic challenge. Can I use my resources in new ways? And a challenge, where do I get the hope? Where do I get the courage? How to inspire hope and courage in others to take risks that are often involved in dealing with real challenges? And that's a challenge to the heart. So it's thinking of leadership in a head, hands, heart kind of way, which is at the heart, so to speak, of our pedagogy as well. So this is the definition that we're using, that leadership is about accepting responsibility, because there is a choice, for enabling others. In other words, for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. So this is the focus on enabling successful collective action and the accomplishment of shared purpose, rather than being a diva or being a sun that illuminates with its light or burns with its heat or whatever it might be. It's a very different notion of leadership. And it's rooted in and came from, the reason we call this practicing democracy is notions of community organizing, in which the core question you ask is, who are my people? And then what is the change they need, that they want? And how can I work with people to enable them to turn their resources into the power they need to achieve that change? So this is, when we're speaking of leadership, and we'll be speaking of leadership teams, this is what we're talking about trying to bring about. It's not just about picket signs. It's about any context in which collective effort around shared values is needed and possible. And so when we teach that approach to leadership, it's structured around these 5 practices. Now, by a practice, I mean something that entails a skill, it entails concepts, and it entails values. In other words, a practice is not just a skill, a hands thing. It's not just a theory, a head thing, and it's not just values, and it's not just instrumentality, it's values, which is a heart thing. And so again, it's that theme of linking those three elements in. So each of these practices then are what we enable our students to learn how to do as a team and as individuals. First is storytelling. We teach how to tell a story of self, us. Now it's motivational and community creating storytelling. Building relationships. These are civic relationships, mostly built out of one-on-ones. Building a shared structure, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Strategizing, how to turn what you have to what you need to get what you want. And action taking, actually making things happen on the ground that are real. Votes in the ballot box, or people at a rally, or whatever it might be. And so this is all sort of, I guess, linked together in this notion of the relationship of self, us, and now, which is the structure of our story approach and really of the whole thing. When we look at outcomes, we're looking we're looking at, are people successful in accomplishing a goal, but also are they coming out of this stronger rather than weaker as a group, as an effective team? And third, are they experiencing individual growth and development as being part of the process? So it's like a three-tiered way of looking at outcomes. Now, the pedagogy that we take here are these points. First of all, in general, it's trying to align what you're learning with how you're learning it. In other words, rather than giving a lecture about relationships, there is a lecture about relationships, but then people form relationships. So it is intended to align pedagogy and practice as closely as we can. So it's project focused. Students take responsibility for an organizing project. That is something where they're bringing people together to accomplish a shared purpose. The pedagogy itself is structured as explanation, modeling, practice, and debriefing. Explain conceptually what it is, model the practice so people can see it, and then in small groups with experienced coaches, practice. And then that practice is debriefed. Sometimes people describe this as how people learn to ride a bicycle. You rarely learn how to ride a bicycle being a student of bicycleology. It usually takes getting on the bike, which then entails falling, and the falling is necessary in order for the learning to happen. And so it's anchored in the ideas of growth mindset that failure or mistakes are data, not judgment. And so creating that kind of learning context is critical for this. So reflective experiential learning generally describes this approach. It requires creating what we call a brave learning space as opposed to a safe learning space, because our pedagogy is one of discomfort. And so enabling students to handle discomfort, which is necessary for learning, is part of what we work at creating the kind of space for that through group norms and through practices like that. The other thing driving this whole thing is sustained coaching. We think coaching is a fundamental form of practice development. And so we train our students not just in how to do these things, but how to coach others in doing these things, because it's a much deeper level than of understanding. And finally, we model, in a sense, what we're doing because we operate as a teaching team. I have an online class and on the ground class going right now. Each one has 7 teaching fellows and a head teaching fellow who work as a team and in that sense model the kind of leadership that we're trying to enable our students to learn. Now, the question is, why teams? Why did we focus on teams and team building? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that this approach, you see the 1 dot here, is so common in leadership, unfortunately, and it's quite problematic, and it's traditional, It's more the approach of the past, and it is widely rejected by young people these days. People we work with in various movements out there, nobody's buying this. And because this is what happens. That's what happens. Either you burn out or people burn out trying to work with you. And it turns out to be a very under mobilizing your resources. It's quite the opposite is what happens. So sometimes the reaction to that is this: no leadership, no structure. We're just all here. We're all adults. We can do exactly, our autonomy is what matters most. And then what you get is this. Joe Freeman wrote a classic piece called The Tyranny of Structurelessness, which addresses this problem: diffuse, uncoordinated, lack of accountability, no strategy. So we wanted to find an alternative. And the alternative we found is really rooted, first of all, in the work of Richard Hackman, who was on my dissertation committee when I was doing my PhD, had a big influence in his organizational behavior work, I think on many, many of us. And so we were trying to find an alternative to chaos and one person, and teams seemed to be a plausible way to try to approach that. Now, we experimented with it first in the context of a project with the Sierra Club on how to develop more effective local chapters in the Sierra Club. What we realized was that in executive education, there's often the belief you bring one person off-site, give them a bunch of skills, and they're going to go back and change everything. It doesn't work that way. And that's one of Richard's points, is if the structure doesn't change, well, then the behavior won't change. And so we were thinking, how do we do that? So we brought whole executive teams of the Sierra Club, local elected teams, and crafted our training around that. The second place where we had an opportunity to try this was in the Obama campaign, in what were called the Camp Obamas, where we launched teams. Rather than individual precinct captains, we launched leadership teams that were responsible for their own precincts or districts or whatever. And it turned out to be something that helped with both motivation and accountability. But then the question became of scale. Fine, we have a collaborative leadership team, that's great, but how do we get to scale? What we discovered was that if each team member then built their own team, we could then build a cascading leadership development practice out into the movement and into the community like that. And of course, at a certain point, it runs out. But the idea is that learners become teachers, followers become leaders, and that's how you build the muscle or the sinew into a social movement or into a community or into anything that we're trying to do. So the challenge came in taking this out of the field and into the classroom, frankly, because we do a lot of back and forth. And a lot of what we've done in the field is through workshops, campaigns, and projects. Like I mentioned, Sierra Club, Obama, the Dreamers campaign was organized in this way, and so forth, this idea of team leadership. For students to learn, our assumption is there has to be an experiential context in which to learn, the practice. And so organizing projects have been that. And so trying to equip students with the capacity to function well as a team turned out to be a little more challenging than we'd anticipated. Because what kept happening was the teams kept falling apart, internal dissent, internal dysfunction. The dysfunction factor just was huge. And so we realized that if you have a dysfunctional team, you're never going to have a functional strategy. And we tested it. We found that to be the case with a project that we did online in the class trying to do this. So what we've been trying to do is figure out how to actually equip our students in the context of classes to function as an effective leadership team, so that then they can offer that kind of leadership to others. And that's what we've been trying to do. This is just a reminder of the Richards Foundation for what it takes to create an effective team. And I have to say, we have found it so useful. Thinking in terms of these three kinds of outcomes, the capacity, the individual growth, and the goal, creating certain conditions of boundedness, stability, and diversity of skills, and bringing people to work, enabling people to define a shared purpose, agree to ground rules, norms, and particular roles. We've also added in a team name and a chant, which also turns out to be brings another piece of it in. This piece of work, purpose and norms, so fundamental. The purpose part, because unless there's enough of a shared values, it becomes very, very problematic. And so we try to distinguish between values and issues, because an issue is a very narrow and limited framed strategy. And so shared purpose means what is our goal, who are our people, and what are we trying to do? The norms, decision-making, conflict resolution, legitimate dissent, how to manage that internal business turns out to be really fundamental. And so this is what we put together last year as a second iteration of how we're trying to do this. It was what we did, we created something we called a course shop. In other words, we did this work in the course of 10 days, first weekend of a Friday, half of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, then 4 days, and then a second weekend. And as you may be able to see from this chart, we took people through launching the course and then teaching coaching to begin with on Friday. On Saturday, we taught narrative work, how to do a story of self, which is how to communicate to others the values that have moved you to what you're moved to be doing, and vice versa. Then relationship building, how to have one-on-one meetings with people to discern their value, their interests, their resources, and where there might be some commonality as a foundation for making a commitment to work together. We found that when people just say, I'm for saving the dolphins, and everybody comes there, it may or may not make a good team. And so we wanted to encourage people to learn enough about each other so that when they decided to form their teams, it was more deeply rooted and better informed in terms of who each other are. And so that's what happened on Saturday, the end of Saturday. We set that out, and then people had until Sunday morning at 10 o'clock to form teams of 3 to 5 people. I should say this was a class of 60 students. And the next morning by 10 o'clock, they had their teams. Once they had their teams formed, then we took them through the process I just described of shared purpose, ground rules, so forth, so as to give them a fair opportunity to launch. I want to pass it to Emily, though, and Maggie, because that's sort of what we've been looking at. So over that period of 10 days, we took them through all these practices in order to come up with what we thought would be a functional team. Over to you, Emily.
Time is at 11:50, so if you were able to stay for just a minute, please do. And then we have the Padlet, so if you have other questions or comments, just add them there.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks, Marshall. So the piece we just want to talk about was, in addition to these pedagogical innovations, starting in 2021, Maggie Hughes, who's a PhD student over at MIT, and I started thinking what kinds of kind of R&D research projects could we do to kind of study what we were actually doing in the classroom. And so we have a few slides about trying to develop a taxonomy for how teams actually form on the basis of these relational values-based scaffolds that Marshall has just talked about. So it's pretty distinct from a lot of ways that other teams form. The presentation before, I think it has a lot of tactical similarities to what we do in terms of helping students find each other. But the practices we teach for helping students connect on the basis of values as compared to interests is something we're particularly interested in. So the research that we're going to present focuses on this very beginning of the course, these kind of yellow boxes about launching the course and then using narrative and relationship building to find people who are values aligned and not just interest aligned. So this is just again, an example of how we use some of the data that we gathered from this year to track how a team formed over time. This team of 63 students had 13 teams of between 2 and 5 people on each team. The connections in these graphs show how much they connected through the scaffold of story of self. One-on-ones is relationship building, and then sort of how connected a team was. So this is an example of a team that was quite connected over time. And then here's an example of a team that wasn't connected over time. So these 5 people did decide to form a team, but they didn't actually do a lot of deep work with each other during the relational scaffolding that we provided them. And this is just a comparison of the two. This is a map of the entire class of 63 people. The colored lines are teams that have ended up forming. The circled dots are that well-connected team. And this is sort of where we're going, is trying to form a taxonomy of team formation processes, that meaning like types of formation that teams go through, as well as variables that kind of define the differences between those types. We're still working on figuring out, testing the validity and reliability of these types, but the goal would be to, once we hopefully validate that these are real types, look at their predictive or correlational relationship to team outcomes and functioning down the line later in the class, the right side of the graph. And then ultimately, practically, they could be used diagnostically, both for teams and for the instructors and coaches of the teams. So I want to thank all these folks, and Maggie especially. We kind of had to jump over Maggie's piece of setting this up, but thank Maggie Hughes, our collaborator in all of this over at the MIT Media Lab.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I want to thank all of you for coming and for joining us for this conversation. I think one of the threads is that this is an ongoing and evolving sort of process, both with the kinds of projects we see and then also with the ways that people are looking at the dynamics of teamwork and group work. Eleanor, do you have any closing?
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming to our session. I want to thank all of our presenters for their really wonderful, rich and detailed descriptions of how they've been using group projects in their courses. We've run over time, so I also appreciate the participation and the patience of our attendees. We hope this won't be the end of discussions around these types of issues. We have the Padlet. We can perhaps outsource some of your questions to our panelists, since we don't have time here. And I think that there are also discussions about maybe some additional programming in the future. So please be on the lookout for that.